Bonhoeffer, pastor, martyr, prophet, spy. Bonhoeffer is one of the most fascinating figures of the 20th century. He was a German pastor who, because of his faith in Jesus, got involved in speaking up for the Jews, speaking against Hitler. He sees non-Christians doing the right thing and the church sometimes doing nothing. And now he looks at himself and he says, am I guilty of this? He wrote about what it meant to be a Christian, explored it deeply, but then he actually lived it out in his life. He escapes to America and then decides, no, I have to go back. He's been living this hardcore life as a pastor, as a prophetic voice to the church, and now as a spy involved in the plot against Hitler. At some point, your talk becomes meaningless, and your actions will show what you actually believe. One of the biggest holes in Western culture today concerns faith. And you have to look really hard to find examples of brilliant people, incredibly courageous people who lived out their faith. And Bonhoeffer is the ultimate example. Hello there. Welcome to Lecture 1. In German, it would be Eins, of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer course. This is a course on an extraordinary figure, impossible to sum up. In the 8 lectures, we will do our best. But his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's how we say it in America. In Germany, it would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But we're in America, so I'm going to go with Bonhoeffer. It is, as I say, virtually impossible to sum up Bonhoeffer. It is what makes him so fascinating. He is undeniably one of the most fascinating, extraordinary figures I have ever encountered. I would suggest that anyone could ever encounter. He's so fascinating. There's so much I want to say in the beginning. Let me start here. My book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer is titled Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. And that will help us kind of frame who he was. He was a pastor. He was a martyr. He was a prophet. He was a spy. I want to talk about that. I didn't just title the book Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy because I wanted it to echo Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy by John le Carre. It's actually important that we think of him as this complex figure who was all those things. He was genuinely a pastor. He was genuinely a martyr. He was genuinely a prophet. We'll talk about what that means. And he was a spy. And what do we mean by that? He was not an assassin, by the way, but he was a spy. He was involved in the plot to kill Hitler. So I want to talk about who he was. And I will be following his life chronologically, obviously, as my book does, not thematically, because the themes on Bonhoeffer, the themes of his life, they're woven all throughout his life. That's what makes him, to my mind, so fascinating, is that the themes that you see at the beginning of his life follow all the way through to the end of his life. That alone is fascinating. He doesn't lurch from thing to thing. He's consistent, but the themes evolve as his thinking evolves. It doesn't evolve dramatically. It evolves slowly, carefully, logically, which is kind of the person that he was. Before we get into Bonhoeffer's life and his chronology, his birth, his background, which I want to talk about in this first lecture, I want to talk about how I came to write a big book, a 600-page book. In German, it's 700 pages, but that's German, about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It started in my mother's womb, but I was very young. I don't remember any of that. Although it kind of did. But it really starts in 1988. I was really struggling with Christian faith. I wasn't really any particular kind of Christian, and I met someone who starts talking to me about God and the Bible, whatever, and he hands me a book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's Bonhoeffer's famous book, The Cost of Discipleship. In German, it's just called Nachfolge, which means discipleship. The English translation is The Cost of Discipleship. And he says, have you ever heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? And I thought, no, I've never heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but because this guy knew my mom grew up in Nazi Germany, he thought I'd be interested in it. And I was totally, I thought, what? Well, who's this? What's this? And so he explains to me, you know, the nutshell version, who is Bonhoeffer? Oh, he was a German pastor who, because of his Christian faith, spoke up for the Jews in Nazi Germany. He was a German pastor who, because of his faith, spoke up against Hitler in Nazi Germany. Now, he got my attention. I thought, you've got to be kidding me, right? What? Like, that's, you know, it's not something people did in Nazi Germany, speak up against Hitler, speak up for the Jews, particularly a Christian pastor. I thought, you know, this kind of Christian I could at least get interested in. This is very interesting to me. It's fascinating to me because my mother grew up in Nazi Germany. She was born in 1934. Hitler took power in 1933. She grew up during this period. My whole family was in Germany during this period. My grandfather, to whom I dedicate my book, Eric, after whom I'm named, Eric, he was an adult during this period. He, as my mother and grandmother have explained to me over the decades, my grandfather did not like Hitler. You don't hear a lot about all the Germans that did not like Hitler. And he didn't want to go to war, but he was drafted. He was sent to the Eastern Front in 1943. He was killed April 4th, 1944. And my whole life, I have grown up in the shadow of that my grandfather was killed at age 32, 31. My mother was 10 years old. So this has always haunted me, that my family were there when this happened. They were there after it happened. Post-war Germany, post-World War II Germany was a nightmare. There was no food. So I grew up always hearing these stories and always wondering, as a German, now my father's Greek from Greece, but my mother, as I just said, is German from Germany, always wondering, what were my people doing and thinking then? My family, many of whom still live there. What was going on? I know that my grandfather didn't like the Nazis. In fact, my grandmother would tell me, that my grandfather would listen to the BBC with his ear literally pressed against the radio speaker for fear of being discovered by the Nazis that he was listening to the BBC to find out what's really going on. There were tons and tons and tons of Germans just like that. You don't hear about them. And so when I heard about Bonhoeffer, I thought, aha, here is someone like my grandfather. He was not on board with what the Nazis were doing. And this guy, Bonhoeffer, who comes from this amazing family, I'll tell you about it in a second, he was vocal about his disagreement with the Nazis. He was fearless about his opposition to the Nazis. Where did that come from? Where does that kind of courage come from? What is that? So the story always haunted me of what happened in Germany. And when I heard about Bonhoeffer from my friend Ed Tuttle, I thought, this is fascinating. And so I was attracted immediately to the idea of Bonhoeffer. That's 1988. And I was simultaneously frightened somewhat, because I thought to myself, as my friend Ed told me, oh yeah, and Bonhoeffer was killed by the Nazis in 1945 in Flossenburg concentration camp. So it's a chilling thing that he spoke up for the Nazis, but he was killed. I also heard, and we'll get into this in depth in these lectures, that he escaped in 1939 to America, but then makes this extraordinary decision to return to Nazi Germany. Unbelievable that he would do that. He didn't have to do that. Why would he do that? And he goes back, and his resistance is even stronger, and then he's killed by the Nazis, whatever. And so I was not a young man of faith when I first heard these things, and I thought, how scary. Why did he do that? Strange. And then when I mentioned, given the book that Bonhoeffer wrote, Cost of Discipleship, Nachfolge, right in the beginning of it, there's a Bonhoeffer quote, a really important quote. And it kind of sums him up. And in the course of these 8 lectures, I will be teasing this out, this theme. But he sums it up, and Bonhoeffer sums things up always kind of brilliantly. It's like a lapidary quote. And the quote is, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." That's not the kind of like chipper encouragement to faith I was looking for in 1988. I was like, I don't know about this. This is a little dramatic, a little harsh. But of course, one of the things we're going to be talking about over the course of these lectures is, what does it mean when Bonhoeffer says, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die? What does that mean? It doesn't mean what we automatically think. And especially when we think of Bonhoeffer in 1948 going to the gallows and literally giving his life as a martyr, we think it means that. Oh, if Christ calls a man and bids him come and, become a martyr and be beheaded or hanged or whatever. So initially it's sort of chilling and off-putting. That's not what Bonhoeffer meant. Bonhoeffer, one of the reasons he's so fascinating, he has the ability to clarify what Christian faith is on such a level that you see death dramatically differently than you normally would. And I'll talk about that in the course of these lectures, because that sort of sums up who he was. He was someone who was so rigorous in his thinking and so faithful as a Christian that he absolutely focuses us on the core of what it means to die to self, and how anyone who doesn't do that ultimately is missing the greatest opportunity in human life. It is the greatest invitation. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. What does it mean? To die to self and to get real life, because your life is fake life. Your life is you're going to die and it's over. And Bonhoeffer's, he's his whole life, he's unpacking this idea. And we'll do it in the course of these lectures. So he really challenges us, and he challenged me when I first encountered him in 1988, to think about, what does everything mean? What is life? What's the meaning of life? I do a thing called Socrates in the City, and we're always asking the big questions. Bonhoeffer was asking the big questions. What does it mean when we talk about life? What is life? What's the meaning of life? What do we mean when we say, we talk about death? These are the ultimate questions, and he extraordinarily, through the course of his life, as we'll see, frames these things in different ways. One of his big themes, which we'll be talking about, is faith in action. In other words, to have faith isn't just an intellectual assent to some ideas, but to live it out. He is the classic example of that. He lives it out all the way to the end, and in the most dramatic, literal fashion, gives his life for his ideas. So that's beautiful. So it haunted me, this connection, because of my German background. I thought about this. In 1988, I never dreamt ever that I would write a book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I never thought I'd write any biographies. I always knew when I was at Yale in the 80s, I was an English major. I always wanted to be a writer. Never dreamt that I would write biographies, ever. I've written 3 big biographies now. This one, obviously, on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then, of course, William Wilberforce and Soupy Sales, the comedian. I did not write a biography about Soupy Sales. I'm just checking. Look it up. I didn't. No, Martin Luther, who's a towering figure in Bonhoeffer's life, because Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor, so we'll get to that as well, and touch on Luther's anti-Semitism and and also Luther's idea, which underscores everything, undergirds the whole 8 lectures we're going to talk about, because it undergirds Bonhoeffer's life, is this idea of we are saved by faith alone. What does that mean? What does it mean? Bonhoeffer tells us that if you take that idea too far, you miss it. And Germany missed it, and that leads to the rise of Adolf Hitler. So it's amazing that bad theology can lead to the Holocaust. Very, very important stuff. So I never thought I'd write a biography of Bonhoeffer, but obviously I did. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is there are a lot of misconceptions about Bonhoeffer. I don't want to get into it now, but initially I was a little confused about him because you hear different things. People have over the years kind of really hit this idea that, oh, he was a pacifist, he was a pacifist, he was a pacifist. That's essentially not true because our definition of pacifism is very different than it was following World War I. We'll get into that too. And also, if he was such a big pacifist, how does he get involved in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler? Kind of confusing, right? So that's, there are a lot of misconceptions about Bonhoeffer. And again, he's such a brilliant figure that it's easy to be confused. And so in the course of writing my book, I just thought, listen, I don't have a dog in the fight. I just want to tell the story of this heroic figure and find out who he really was. And it was far more fascinating writing the book than I ever dreamt because he is dramatically consistent. I was expecting that, he's going to lurch around and change his ideas. He's a pacifist. He's not a pacifist. Not true. And that, again, is a testament to the genius of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is that very early on, he knows what he believes, and his life is really just a process of unpacking those beliefs, deepening those beliefs. And so in the course of writing the book, I was more and more fascinated to find out who he actually was. It's dramatic. I don't want to get too much ahead of myself. There's a reason the book is 600 pages. There's a lot to his story. It's so fascinating. It has so many pieces and so many figures and stuff. If you've seen the movie, by the way, I'm assuming you've seen the movie. If you haven't seen it, it is spectacular. Do not miss it. Run. But a 2-hour movie can't begin to do justice to the complexity of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. One of the biggest ellipsis in the movie is it doesn't even touch on his love affair, his engagement to Maria von Wedemeyer. That's one of the most moving things. I was forced to reread my book recently in preparation for this course, and I was moved literally to tears reading about this love affair, this engagement with this amazing young woman. It's so beautiful and underscores the tragedy of his death, that he was in love, looking forward to marriage. The movie doesn't even touch on that because, again, if you're making a 2-hour film, you can only you have to kind of pick a slice and go with it. And so the film does a truly spectacular job, but it doesn't even touch on this moving love affair. And there are a number of other things that it can't go into. So we're going to put all that stuff in the TV series, 10-part TV series. Yeah, if you want to fund that, see me after this lecture. Okay, so let's just leap into Bonhoeffer's life. His family, I say this, I've lectured on Bonhoeffer hundreds of times, and I always start with the fact that in 1906, he was born into what can only be described as an absolutely extraordinary family. When you read about his family in my book or anywhere, you cannot help but be fascinated and a little bit jealous. It is such an amazing family. You almost feel like you're making this up. Bonhoeffer later in life, and we'll touch on this a lot, he became best friends with Eberhard Bethge. I had the privilege in 2008, my wife and I visited Germany, and we spent time with Eberhard Bethge's widow. She was the niece of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. She figures in this story. We spent an afternoon with her. And her husband, Eberhard Bethge, he wrote the 1,100-page reference work on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And a lot of the stuff that I say ultimately came from him. But he wrote something, I'll put it up. He writes, "The rich world of Bonhoeffer's ancestors set the standards for Dietrich Bonhoeffer's own life. It gave him a certainty of judgment and manner that cannot be acquired in a single generation. He grew up in a family that believed the essence of learning lay not in a formal education, but in the deeply rooted obligation to be guardians of a great historical heritage and intellectual tradition. Okay, so just to sum up who the family was, and again, there's a lot here. It's almost unbelievable who this family. It's like talking about the Kennedys or so. It's just they don't even come up to the level of the Bonhoeffer family, to be honest. His father was the most famous doctor in Germany for 50 years. He was easily one of the most famous scientists in Europe for decades. So that's the father of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Bonhoeffer grows up in a family that is profoundly intellectual, that is respected culturally, respected in the community. His father is a huge deal. His mother is also a big deal. Absolutely brilliant. Both parents were brilliant. They had 8 kids. Bonhoeffer was the youngest of 4 boys and 4 girls. Every one of these kids is brilliant. Every one of these kids marries someone who is brilliant. Again, it's hard to exaggerate about what an amazing family this was. Now, it's interesting. The father, as I said, was one of the great scientists of the early 20th century. Later on, I don't know if I'll get to it, but he figures prominently in what happens in Germany in the 30s, after when the Reichstag fire happens, a huge thing. We'll talk in a few lectures from now. In 1933, who is summoned to do the psychiatric evaluation of the Dutch arsonist, the young man, van der Lubbe, who set the fire that burns the Reichstag, that really allows Hitler and the Nazis to take total power in Germany? Who is brought in to examine this arsonist? Dietrich Bonhoeffer's father is brought in. On and on it goes from there. His father plays a prominent role in what happens in Germany under the Nazis because of who he is. Great scientist. Now, his sons, apart from the 3 elder sons, they kind of take, this is sort of a funny thing, not to be genetically fatalist, but the 3 sons, apart from Dietrich, who's the 4th, have the same coloring, this very dark coloring of the father's family, the Bonhoeffer coloring. And they kind of follow in his footsteps in terms of being men of science. Bonhoeffer's eldest brother, Carl Friedrich, goes on to split the atom with Einstein. I mean, it's this level of, one of the top physicists in the world. That's his eldest brother, Carl Friedrich. His other brother, Klaus, becomes the legal head of Lufthansa. So that's the father's side of the family, in a sense. The mother's side of the family, the von Hazes, they have dramatically light coloring. They're those tow-headed people who, start going bald if they're men at age 17, right? Like such fine hair, like super bright white blonde hair. Bonhoeffer gets those genes. And as I said, I met Eberhard Bethge's wife. We spent time with her. That's Bonhoeffer's niece. She had that coloring, piercing blue eyes, and this super blonde hair, thin, fine hair. Why do I say this? I say this because I find it funny that Dietrich Bonhoeffer takes after his mother in a few ways. Her brother was a pastor. Her grandfather and great-grandfather were both very important theologians. She was, as a young girl, involved in the Herrnhuter. This is Count Zinzendorf, this pietistic Moravian community. People of tremendous faith, actual faith, and theologically very sophisticated, because as I mentioned, the father and the great-grandfather were big theologians, not just pastors, but theologians. So Bonhoeffer, in his genes, has this pastoral Christian foundation at the same time that he has this highfalutin academic theological foundation. So he decides to go in that direction. But this is all there, this extremely rich family heritage. I'll be touching on that as we move along. But Bonhoeffer was, I think, how do we put this? The environment in which he grew up, you get the impression that, again, this is practically like the ideal family. Like, you can't help but think, oh man, what a beautiful family. I think of Ingmar Bergman's final film, I think Fanny and Alexander, just this rich, beautiful world of 1910. They had, they weren't like wealthy, but I'll read from my book. Their mother presided over the well-appointed home. The staff included a governess, a nursemaid, a housemaid, a parlor maid, and a cook. Paula Bonhoeffer, his mother, homeschooled all the kids up until a certain age. She disapproved of the harsh Prussian educational methods, and she thought, I want to educate my kids. And so she had a schoolroom in the house. She was a very sophisticated educator. She was, as I've said, and I will continue to say, an absolutely brilliant woman. So he grows up in this world, and I should say that so the three eldest brothers and the two sisters, the elder sisters, they were kind of a group of five. And then you have Bonhoeffer's twin sister, Sabina. He was born 10 minutes before she was. He teased her about that for the rest of their lives. And obviously, as twins, they were extremely close. And then his sister, Susanna, who was the youngest sister. So the three of them, Bonhoeffer, Sabina, and Susanna, they kind of formed this little trio. They kind of hung out together. They were the younger group. And they were overseen by a governess, Fräulein Käthe van Horn and Maria van Horn. They come from the Herrnhuter world, from the pietistic Moravian world. So these are profound women of faith charged with educating these little kids. They're the governesses for these kids. So Bonhoeffer has faith at the center of his life, but the mother was also big on this. Their daily life, this is in the Bonhoeffer home. And now keep in mind, the father was probably an agnostic, and you get the impression that the three older boys were kind of agnostics. But they respected the mother, the father, this was never an issue in the house. There was great respect in the family between the mother and father. And again, if you think of the ideal marriage, it's hard not to think of their marriage as the ideal marriage, just beautiful. Daily life was filled in the Bonhoeffer home with Bible reading and hymn singing, all of it led by Frau Bonhoeffer. Her reverence for the scriptures was such that she read Bible stories to her children from the actual Bible text and not from a children's retelling. Again, I can't say everything I want to say. I guess you have to read the book. But there is so much right in the beginning of his life that is compelling, and that you begin to see this is the setup for why he's so great, what makes him who he is. I want to say again, though, the father, being a great scientist, instilled in all the kids a profound respect for truth, for evidence, for facts. He was, by being this, gigantic figure in Berlin as a scientist and a doctor, he really stood against this encroaching world of Freud. And that he never spoke about it publicly. He didn't make an issue of it, but he was a true brain doctor and scientist who kind of stood against the vague world of Freud, and instilled in his kids a respect not just for facts and evidence and science, but to think clearly, to express oneself clearly, not to just yammer on. If you have nothing to say, feel free to shut up. And if you don't shut up, somebody in the family will mock you for whatever dumb thing you said. You could see that there was a standard in the family. Bonhoeffer's twin sister said her father possessed great tolerance that left no room for narrow-mindedness and broadened the horizons of our home. He took it for granted that we would try to do what was right and expected much from us. but we could always count on his kindness and the fairness of his judgment. He had a great sense of humor, and by the way, Bonhoeffer himself also did throughout his life, and often helped us to overcome inhibitions with a timely joke. He had too firm a grip on his emotions to allow himself ever to speak a word to us which was not wholly suitable. Hard not to admire a man like that. I think most of us, and I'm at the top of the list, fall short. This man was in control of his emotions. His dislike of cliches, this is Sabina, did at times make some of us inarticulate and uncertain of ourselves. They were afraid to talk because they thought if we misstep or say something, he's gonna look at us funny. But it has the effect that as adults, we no longer had any taste for catchwords, gossip, commonplaces, or loquacity. He himself would never have used a catchword or a trendy phrase. So that's the Bonhoeffer family. Those are the parents, really inescapably impressive human beings who raised all of their children to the highest standard, to the very, very highest standard. It's just undeniable. I mentioned the mother's faith. She also had spent time as a young girl with the Herrnhuters, the Moravian world. So there was a genuine kind of faith, and I should say that Count Zinzendorf, now this is the 18th century, but just so you understand what you're dealing with the Herrnhuter and the Moravians, Zinzendorf advocated the idea of a personal relationship with God rather than the formal church-going Lutheranism of the day. Zinzendorf used the term living faith, which he contrasted unfavorably with the prevailing nominalism of dull Protestant orthodoxy. Zinzendorf's ideas influenced John Wesley, who visited Herrnhut in 1738, which was the year of Wesley's famous conversion. So Zinzendorf is a giant, and when we think that carries on, through the 17th century, through the 18th century, early part of the 19th century, Bonhoeffer's mother would have visited probably around 1890, but that kind of living faith, relationship with God, as opposed to the dull Protestant orthodoxy of the day. In a way, that also sets up Bonhoeffer for who he ends up being, because as we'll see going on, he's very disappointed in the German church, in the Lutheran church. They seem to be going through the motions, and he's trying to advocate, as you'll see, for them to have a living faith, to step out in an active way as a result of their faith when the Nazis come to power, to use their faith to stand against the Nazis. So all of this underscores his development. When you're talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's early life, it doesn't take long before he's born in 1906, before you get to World War I. We know World War I starts in 1914. Now, the Bonhoeffers, it's worth saying, they were very patriotic Germans, but they were not overly patriotic in the sense that, I as a Christian would say, you don't want to make an idol of patriotism. I think it's healthy to be patriotic. It's unhealthy not to have patriotism, but can you take it too far? The classic case of taking nationalism too far is Germany going into World War I. It's hard for us today to imagine Germany fighting to the death with the French. You think, what is going on there? We're not going to get into that. But the fact of the matter is, it happened. You can look it up. It's called World War I. And they thought it would be over pretty quick. It was not. It took 4 years. Bonhoeffer's 3 elder brothers all served in the war. Bonhoeffer was close with his brother Walter. Obviously, Walter's much older. But in 1917, Carl Friedrich, who goes on to become the physicist, and Walter were called up. They were both born in 1899, so it's their turn. Bonhoeffer was 12 years old at the time. Walter goes to war. 2 weeks later, is killed. And this is such a wound in the Bonhoeffer family. His mother, Paula Bonhoeffer, sort of loses her mind a little bit over this. Keep in mind, she has 3 sons in the war. One of them is killed. Carl Friedrich is in the war. Finally, the youngest, Klaus, is called up. I think they pulled some strings so that Klaus would not be on the front lines, because the thought of losing another son, you can only imagine what happened. But Walter's funeral in 1917, Paula, her brother, preaches the funeral sermon. Imagine your 17 or 18-year-old son has just been killed. Paula Bonhoeffer also chose the hymns for her son's funeral in 1918. And the one that I wanted to quote, just to give you some sense of the kind of faith we're talking about in Paula Bonhoeffer, it's a famous Lutheran hymn from the 17th century. The English translation doesn't really do it justice, but what it says is, what God has done, imagine her son has just died. What God has done, it is well done. His will is always just. Whatever he will do to me, in him I'll ever place my trust. For her to choose that as a statement of faith at her son's funeral, that is just as bold as it gets. And I think, I remember, I guess, my senior year in college, someone was killed, someone really extraordinary in a car accident. And his father was a minister, and at the funeral, he said something like this. And I thought, wow, that is faith. What kind of faith must you have to be able to say that when you've just lost a tremendously beloved son? So now Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he's 12. He really loved and looked up to his brother Walter. So this must have been very tough for him. Now, I should say, to go along with the Forrest Gump theme of the Bonhoeffer family, the Germans obviously lose the war in 1918. This is devastating, very devastating for Germany. We'll get into it. It sets up the rise of the Nazis and everything. The Allies imposed very, very strict conditions on Germany. One is the Versailles Treaty, which is devastating. It was, I think, in retrospect, obviously far too harsh, imposed on Germany. And the Allies also insisted the end of the German monarchy. So the Kaiser is the German form of Caesar. The Russian version is Tsar. So the Kaiser, this monarch, is forced to abdicate. It's an amazing thing. So they send Field Marshal von Hindenburg to do the dirty work, to go to Kaiser Wilhelm at the Supreme Headquarters in Spa and let him know you have to abdicate. This is just humiliating for the Germans. But in keeping with the Forrest Gump theme of how the Bonhoeffer family is everywhere, I'll read from my book. When Hindenburg left the conference room after that meeting, a 17-year-old orderly from Grunewald, that's where the Bonhoeffer family home was located, was standing in the hallway. Klaus Bonhoeffer, this is Dietrich's brother, never forgot the moment when the stout Hindenburg brushed past him. He later described the exiting Hindenburg as being, quote, rigid as a statue, both in countenance and bearing. So Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus is standing there when Hindenburg exits from this unbelievably historic moment. It's like you are there at the moment when the Kaiser is forced to abdicate, when the Allies have imposed these harsh conditions on Germany. Klaus was standing right there. He got to tell his family about it. It's almost unbelievable. So the war is over. Germany descends into what can only be described as chaos. They have never had democracy before, and any of us, a lot of people don't even understand what democracy is. There are different kinds of democracy. Some democracies are not so hot. The Weimar Republic was forced on Germany. They didn't have a history of democracy. They had done quite well under the Kaiser. It was not exactly a tyrannical monarchy. But so suddenly they're forced to have a Reichstag and to have democracy, and it really leads to chaos in Germany because they didn't know how to govern themselves. This is not the time for me to lecture on that. I wrote a book called If You Can Keep It, and I talk about this a lot. What does it mean to govern yourself? What is self-government? What is liberty on the American model? They didn't have that in Germany. It was just imposed on them by the Allies. And so suddenly they're trying to govern themselves, and it leads to chaos. It leads to factions and so on and so forth. It leads, as we now know, to economic depression on a level we can't even comprehend. So Germany in the 20s is a mess, and this prepares the way for the ascent of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. At age 13, in 1919, Bonhoeffer's 13, so this is a year after his brother's death, he decides firmly, I am going to be a theologian. Again, in a family like this where they're kind of looking at you funny and, criticizing you, very, very big deal for him to say, I want to be a theologian. Anybody know any 13-year-olds who say, I would like to be a theologian? Pretty dramatic. Again, he's following the footsteps of his grandfather, his great-grandfather, but he was brilliant, in case I haven't said it yet, absolutely brilliant. He decides he wants to do it, but he doesn't announce it formally to the family until he's 14. He thought, I better make sure I know, what I'm thinking about this, because he knew that they're going to give him a hard time, and they really did give him a hard time. In fact, his brother, Klaus, I just mentioned Klaus was standing there when Hindenburg brushes past at Spa after the Kaiser has been forced to abdicate. Klaus was, with the other brothers, critical of Dietrich. They knew how brilliant he was, and by the way, he was also a virtuoso musician. So at this point, they're all thinking he may go into music. He's brilliant. But they kind of mock him. So his brother Klaus, when Bonhoeffer says, I'm going to be a theologian, and also probably says, and I want to be a pastor, his brother says that the church, so the brother's mocking this, right? And he says the church is a poor, feeble, boring, petty bourgeois institution. And the 14-year-old Bonhoeffer says, in that case, I shall have to reform it. How many 14-year-olds would have the chutzpah to say that I'm going to reform the church? Not just I've just chosen to go into theology, but I want to reform the church. It's really amazing. And guess what? That is exactly what he ends up doing, one way or the other, as we'll see. It's amazing to me, and it's amazing to me that we even have the record of that, that the Bonhoeffers wrote a lot about everything. They record this moment when this precocious 14-year-old says that he vows to reform the church. I should say that Bonhoeffer's mother, Paula, gives Dietrich, around this time, his brother Walter's Bible. So Walter had been killed in the war. They put this in the film, actually. He's given his brother's Bible. For the rest of his life, Dietrich Bonhoeffer used it for his daily devotions. I mean, imagine what it meant to him to have the Bible that belonged to his brother who'd been killed. In 1921, so Bonhoeffer's 15 years old, we have a record of him going to the first evangelistic meeting of his life. Now, again, we have to be real clear. The church in Germany, Christians in Germany, tended to go along with the dull Protestant Lutheran orthodoxy. So they'd go to church, and it really was a petty bourgeois kind of dull institution. You have the Herrnhuter and the Zinzendorf really living out their faith, but that's not typical in Germany. So Bonhoeffer's experience of the church is very, very mixed. But at age 15, he goes in Berlin. The Salvation Army had, because there was so much suffering, poverty, because, again, of the war, because the economy had tanked, starving people. Bramwell Booth, who's the son of the founder of the Salvation Army, visits Germany. They're feeding people. You know, they're doing what Christians are supposed to do, right? Feeding the hungry, and this goes on. And in 1921, General Bramwell Booth visits. Bonhoeffer's 15, and in Berlin preaches a big evangelistic meeting. Bonhoeffer goes to that and was very affected by it. Bonhoeffer's sister Sabina, his twin sister, recalled that Dietrich was eager to take part in it. He was the youngest person there, but he was very interested. He was impressed by the joy he had seen on Booth's face. And he told us of the people carried away by Booth and of the conversions. So somebody raised, you know, as the grandson and great-grandson of theologians, as the nephew of a pastor, hadn't seen this kind of Christianity. He's exposed to what many Americans are today familiar with, but he got seen it before, and it really affected him. And he wouldn't see this again dramatically until he goes to New York a few years later. But it's just interesting to me that he was interested in seeing this, and that he was in fact moved by it, and that he remarks on being moved by the joy that he saw. Joy that you don't typically you don't associate that with Lutheran liturgy or it, there's this formality. So he was moved by that kind of faith. Well, by the time he's 17, it's time to go to college. He followed in the family's footsteps by spending his first year at Tübingen University. His father had been there. There's a lot I can say about that. We don't really have time. He joins a fraternity. Again, it's actually pretty interesting, and some of it's funny, but I don't have time right now. But I have to say that one of the members of the fraternity remembered Bonhoeffer as extremely secure and self-confident, but able to tolerate criticism. He was also a companionable, physically agile and tough young man who possessed a sharp nose for essentials and a determination to get to the bottom of things, and who was also capable of subtly teasing people and who had a great deal of humor. I mentioned this a few places in my book. It amazes me that throughout his life, people mention his humor, his sense of humor. So I want to be real clear. We often get this version of Bonhoeffer as dour and, headed to the gallows. You've got to throw that away and understand this is a man who loved life, who appreciated every aspect of life, of culture, and at the heart of it was this keen sense of humor. Well, so getting back to the state of Germany, Germany is in free fall. 1923 was particularly disastrous. The German mark, my goodness, I should say this. In 1921, the German mark, it dropped the value to 75 marks to the dollar. In 1922, it dropped to 400 marks to the dollar. By early 23, it plunged to 7,000 marks to the dollar. So this is, again, the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty were crippling Germany economically. By November 1923, $1 was worth about 4 billion German marks. So Germany is trying to figure out, what do we do here? We're falling apart. The Versailles Treaty is too harsh. One of the terms of the Versailles Treaty was you cannot have an army, because they were so threatened. The Allies were so threatened by Germany. It was like, oh, you don't get to have an army either. And Germany was actually worried just over the border. I should say they were only allowed to have a 100,000-man army. And so they were really concerned. The Russians just over the border in Poland, might have marched in at any point to subdue them. There was a lot of trouble. So the Germans, to get around this, did kind of private training of young men. So they weren't officially in the army, but almost like a militia or something like that. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, famously called a pacifist, which he was not, he enrolls in this. He decides, yes, I'm going to do this. So it's 1923, November 23. What does that make him? 17 years old. He's attending Tübingen University, and he goes to serve in what's called the Black Reichswehr. And he writes back home to his family, "Today I am a soldier." So he's proud of this. He's proud of this. Again, to push against this idea that he's a pacifist, or that they were all pacifists. They were against hyper-nationalism. They were against going to war for no reason. They were against Hitler's kind of nationalism. But they certainly didn't feel that a country shouldn't be able to protect itself. Around his 18th birthday, and this is important, Bonhoeffer, anyway, he was very, I mentioned in one of the quotes, very physically agile, doing all kinds of stuff, very, very interested in sports. He slips and falls on the ice. He was skating on the Neckar River in Tübingen. I have visited there. And he lay unconscious for some time. So his family really is deeply worried about him. And they go to visit. And while they're there, his 18th birthday, they celebrate his 18th birthday, and he gets this idea in his head to play on their sympathy for their son who almost died skating, to say to them that he wants to do a semester in Rome. Now, Rome, we've got to be clear, if you receive the kind of classical education that Bonhoeffer received, to go to Rome would be like a dream. So long story short, he and Klaus, that's his next older brother, they visit Rome. And what we see there, this sets us up for the future. Bonhoeffer, for the first time, is seriously asking the question, what is the church? Now imagine you come from a Lutheran German church. Now he goes to Rome, and Bonhoeffer, again, being brilliant and incredibly curious, intellectually curious, culturally curious. He goes to every kind of Roman Catholic church service. He buys a missal to follow along, and he's really moved by what he sees. He observed the universality of the church. Now, this is going to figure into his future, right? To ask the question, what is the church? Is the church just the German church, or does the church extend beyond the boundaries of Germany? What is the church? So he sees in Rome example after example of this thing called the church universal. There's a moment, I guess he's at a service, and he sees people of every race and color celebrating. This is the quote from Bonhoeffer. The universality of the church was illustrated in a marvelously effective manner. White, black, yellow members of religious orders. Everyone was in clerical robes, united under the church. It truly seems ideal. So he's asking these questions now. What is the church? And he sees something here. Now imagine that he's open-minded enough. He's going to be a Lutheran pastor. He's been steeped in German Lutheranism, but he's open-minded enough not to say, oh, these are the Catholics, we want nothing to do with them. He is very moved by it and open to it, and is asking the question, is there something I can learn here from people? Maybe I disagree with them on some things, but can they teach me something? Are we getting something wrong? He starts wondering about the Lutheran Church. He starts wondering about the Reformation. Was the Reformation a good thing? He begins asking these questions. Now, he has just turned 18, but he's asking these questions. These are the questions he will ask for the rest of his life. As you'll see, he writes his doctoral dissertation on the question of what is the church, and then he kind of lives it out, as we'll get to. He also says that that Palm Sunday in Rome, he attends evensong and was deeply moved by it. He says, with unbelievable simplicity, grace, and great seriousness, they sang evensong while a priest officiated at the altar. The ritual was truly no longer merely ritual. Instead, it was worship in the true sense. The whole thing gave one an unparalleled impression of profound, guileless piety. He's really thinking about this. What is mere religion as opposed to real faith? What is mere ritual? When does ritual move past ritual into worship of God? It's at least interesting that he asked these questions profoundly for the first time while he's in Rome, while he sees it in the Catholic tradition. I think that's very, very important. But as I said, it's 1923, 24. He's going to leave Tübingen, go back to Berlin. He's going to study at Berlin University. This sets us up now for the rise of the Nazis. It sets us up for all that follows, and a lot follows, but I hope that at least lays the foundation. It gets more exciting and crazy as we move along, but that's the foundation. That's the childhood and family life of Bonhoeffer up until his 18th birthday and his visit to Rome.